I'm Luke Williams. I'm a lead designer at Bossa Studios.
When you first, can you take us back to the small apartment or room or house or garage or basement you were in when you first had the idea for Surgeon Simulator?
Yeah, like weirdly enough, I can see the room from my bedroom. There's a technology college I can see at my window, and that was when I first moved here, back in the start of 2013, and that was just happened to be where the Global Game Jam was being hosted, closest to us and our studio, because we're down in Shoreditch in London. And yeah, so I was like, well, that's sweet. It's right outside my door, so that's handy. And yeah, and it was three of the guys from Bossa, like Tom, Jack, James. Just we kind of thrown together. We hadn't really worked together that much. We were all sort of like dotted around the studio, and we hadn't really, sort of been assigned anything. But I think, the company was like, hey, you four, you probably gel well, so off you go, spend a weekend at this. So we did, and it really just started with the theme of that year's Global Game Jam, which was just a sound of a heartbeat.
So many of these massive successful games have started out as game jams, and they continue to do so to this very day. What do you think that program opens up for future gaming programmers and current programmers like yourself?
I mean, yeah, they've been such a staple, I think, now, especially since then. And I think the reason you're getting some interesting stuff out of it is because there isn't any expectation going in or coming out. I mean, the worst thing actually was doing game jams after Surgeon Simulator, because then you're like, is everyone going to expect like another sort of big YouTube game? And I think, because I always say, if you were to pitch Surgeon Simulator in to publishers or other studios, and be like, all right, cool, so it's like this really, really hard to play surgery game, and we control each finger with a key on your keyboard, and you're always going to fail. It's going to be really hard. You wouldn't get anywhere. But because a game jam gives you that opportunity just to throw anything around and mess about, you never really know what you're going to kind of come out with.
When you were creating that system, did you and your partners ever think, oh, hey, this game doesn't control very well, people are going to be it's going to be frustrating, people aren't going to enjoy it? Did that thought process come up at all? Was the whole kind of idea was to kind of make it a gag, oh yeah, it'll be so frustrating, people will have fun?
Yeah, I mean, we were basing it on QWOP, right? The game where you have to run and do hurdles, and you have to control each of the muscles in the guy's leg. It's like a little flash game, and it's basically practically impossible. But you do get people who get good at it, right? Because at the end of the day, the controls are consistent. So for us, I think the original name we're going to go with was Cooperation as a reference. And then we thought, oh no, we'll name it after all the keys that you have to press, similar to this QWOP. You have to use Q, W, O, and P. So they just named use the names of the keys you have to press. And so it was going to end up being A and E and R and spacebar or something like that. Really convoluted name, because it was well, that's funny, isn't it? A stupid name. So we always knew, that it was going to be basically impossible to play. But one of the key things, at least, it would be consistent. You have to kind of almost detach what you know about games to play it, because it is so alien, having to use the mouse to control the wrist and the grabbing and the lowering, and then the keys for each finger. But the controls never changed, they were never random. So what we saw is that people would actually feel like, I'm getting good at this, and then they would keep playing, and they would slowly get to the point where it looks like a competent game because they've learned how to play it.
You guys, I don't know if you guys personally did the port, but the game was ported to VR eventually. What was it like working in that medium, and was that new for you and your team at the time?
Yeah, I mean, so we had access to early VR kits, really early. So we had the original Oculus version, DK1, and this was back in 2013, because we just launched, and we inevitably had a game perfect for VR, even though when we were making it, we weren't really thinking about that. But suddenly it became a very familiar scene in every VR game, which is the hand and some sort of diorama. So we were kind of well positioned, and we already had a game that basically perfectly mirrored to how VR is set up. So we had the DK1. It was horrible blurry mess and smudging and everything, but we thought, oh, we'll mess around with it, and because we thought it'd be cool. And what we actually did is because there was no motion controls back then with the DK1, but there were these like magnetic sort of like controllers from Razer called the Razer Hydras, and that had like a little ball that you put on your desk, and it would track by electromagnetism like the where the controllers were and their orientation, everything like that. It was only ever used for like a Portal 2 DLC, but I'm not sure how many people played. But we used that to basically act as our motion controls. So this is way back in 2013 before any of the VR kits and devs had any kind of motion controls, and we had these Razer Hydras, and we took it to like events in the UK like Rezzed and Eurogamer, and we would have like queues around the booth because everyone heard that we had like a VR kit. And so yeah, that was interesting. And so that's kind of where we learned from it, and that's where we developed the relationship with like Oculus and Steam. Obviously were developing their own VR headset at the time. So we got all the early dev kits, like all the like 3D printed kind of messy things that would like, they looked like contraptions from Saw. So you'd put them on and worried that they would just slam shut or something. And so yeah, like going into it, we knew that the game was going to be like obviously a lot easier to play. And so there was that thing of, well, why then? Because isn't the whole point about surgery simulators? It's really hard to play. So we added like a few little more mechanics. We had, when we developed the mobile version, we had this whole notion of like heart rate. So in the original release, you just had to worry about how much blood he had. But then we made it in the mobile version because it was a little bit more, again, almost as a response to the fact that the hand is no longer there, it's your fingers and just touching the touchscreen. So we're like, okay, so we need some more mechanics to make it more difficult. So therefore, Bob can have a heart attack and you need to like defib him and other things like that. And so we kind of ported that across into the VR version. So while you are more precise, you have to we actually make you be more careful because Bob is prone to heart attacks, and then you have to rush over and charge the defibrillators to get him back.
Yeah, that's, it's funny that you say that because we covered VR back in its infancy as well with, when it was Crystal Cove was the code name for the VR headset. Yeah. Does it blow your mind how far VR has come? I mean, now they have it on the PlayStation. I mean, your game is even on the PlayStation in VR with motion controls.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like even the DK1, when you first put that on, it felt kind of transformative in a way that you were like, hang on a minute, like this is going to like kind of change things. Even ignoring all the smeary pixel resolutions and stuff like that, you could tell that kind of sense of presence was something kind of special. And it's interesting because I think a lot of it was the hype of VR was kind of driven because you had to have people try it. You couldn't, because I think there was all this idea of that they were just like goggles you put on and then you just saw a screen in front of you. There was no way to describe the presence that you get when you're in a VR headset. And I think that's kind of been one of the big challenges of VR is like convincing people, especially when it's as expensive as it is. You really need to make a jump. I think that's why PlayStation was exciting, because it was such a sort of lower barrier to entry, right? You just got to buy the headset. You can do VR on your console. You don't have to get any special backpacks or
or tracking things or modulators.
Yeah. Like the little like sort of lighthouses in the corner of your rooms. Yeah.
Can you talk about, you mentioned the word the YouTube game. What does that phrase mean to you and your team?
I mean, it was accidental, obviously, but I remember in the initial meetings because at the time, if you remember Slender, that was blowing up, and that was like a quick made in Unity game, and all the YouTubers were playing it, and it was like a quick thrown together thing, so it looked about as rough as Surgeon did, at least the original like Game Jam Surgeon. And we did sort of like jokingly be like, God, imagine if we were like the next game to like where all the YouTubers were playing, and then we just found out never happened. We just like kind of laughed it off. And so there's been a lot of just analyzing why and how in subsequent games. So we even had I Am Bread kind of follow it, and that was almost, then it was like kind of being a little bit more deliberate, that this idea of there's an audience watching, so how can you make a game that allows someone on YouTube or Twitch, I mean Twitch didn't exist at the time, but perform, like give them the tools to kind of make more of a performance. And then I feel like that is a good way to think about it. Obviously, we just stumbled on it with Surgeon, but it's definitely something that I've been looking into and sort of developing with further games. And I think kind of going against usually a YouTube game, it gets usually kind of like put as like YouTube bait. They usually get referred to, and they're kind of like games that are just thrown together. They're pretty crappy. They don't play very well. They're not very fun, but they're like really difficult, and they're made to like have to, you know, streamer or YouTuber kind of scream and rage and blah blah blah. So I think we were consciously not trying to sort of be that, right? We were like, no, you know, we're going to put a lot of work into making sure that while the controls are frustrating and hard to play, they are consistent and you can get better at them. There's no randomness going on, except for maybe when you're in the back of the ambulance and it's getting stuff thrown around. And then we added like a whole sort of weird, disturbing like backstory to it, that we knew we had like limited resources and we already had the desk, but we were like seeding and talking about what is this world that it's in. And so that's why we came up with like, you know, this fictional county of Barnardshire, which is like the smallest county in England, which is why you haven't heard of it. And everything there is just a bit shit. The doctors don't know what they're doing, and everyone's a little bit weird. And so we kind of like just leaned into that and tried to add little story where we could. We had fun with achievements, so there's all these like, you know, random surreal achievements that you have to kind of play through and mess around. And so yeah, we just wanted it to not be some throwaway YouTube bait game. You know, we tried to add as much kind of fun and polish to it as we could.
You know, speaking to that, like, what do you think being in the UK? You mentioned a little bit of inspiration from certain areas in the UK, but what do you think being there contributed to the game's development and story and design, as opposed to maybe if you were in America or somewhere else in the EU?
When you look at something like Faulty Towers, and there's almost a pride in the naffness of it all, like it's a bad hotel run by a bad person, but like you still kind of rooting for them. And so I think there's this just in this kind of discourse in England, or like this sort of being proud of your like inadequacies and how it's all a little bit grey and shit here, I guess, for the most part. So we kind of leaned into that. Like, so we all sort of grew up in sort of like late 80s and 90s, and we didn't grow up in London. We were like, I was in Cornwall, Devon, the other guys were like Midlands, Birmingham, sort of thing. So we weren't the glitzy Londoners. We were just naff cities that you won't have heard of in England, on towns and stuff. And so we kind of leaned into that of just being like, we're just countryside out in the digs, like just rubbish England, and there's a charming kind of humor to it. And so we kind of leaned on that, and I think that for a lot of people kind of resonated. And then in terms of like the era, because we had like, when we were thinking of what the music would be, and we knew that we weren't a serious game, but we wanted to almost come across as serious. There was a lot of games on YouTube then, like Farming Simulator and stuff. They were actually serious simulators, but they were being played stupidly. So we thought, well, we're going to be a stupid simulator that you do play stupidly, but we're going to at least make people think initially that it's a serious actual game. And so people going into it are like, oh, it's going to be one of those, you know, an actual simulator game, but they're going to break it and play it stupidly, and it quickly unravels into like, oh no, this is actually just absurd. And so to kind of like amp up like how serious it was, we were looking at like British TV shows for like music, and there was one in the 90s called Casualty, which is like this overly serious, like tense music. And what we found is that the most recent ones, because like it's been around since the 80s, the most recent stuff is, you know, like pretty contemporary. But when you go back to the 80s, it was almost comedic because it was all just synth and drums and like a proper 80s like bopping soundtrack. And it completely jarred with actually the subject material of Casualty, which is like a running of a hospital and like disasters and as like a drama, a TV drama. And so it was just this funny thing of like, oh, like since then, like back then, this would have been like a super serious soundtrack, but now it's just hilarious. It just completely doesn't match with the content. So we nicked that for the Game Jam version. I think we eventually had to take it out, just obviously because the BBC were going to come after us. But it kind of inspired the setting of like, okay, so we now know it's going to be in like the 80s. We're going to have a synthwave, like drums and that soundtrack, you know. So we were before the 80s revival. I always like to say we were ahead of the curve on that one. And also back then, all the technology just looked shit. Like you had like beige telephones and all the devices were just like overly large and chunky, and it kind of lended itself to the game and the era. So that's why we went all in on basically naff England in the 80s.
Did you ever like? I mean, you already stated that you didn't go back to make it a YouTube game, but moving forward, like, what did you learn from watching all the? I mean, at the time where I don't even think they were called influencers; they were called YouTubers. That's how early this was.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that process, going back and seeing all these? I mean, at the time, early YouTubers, now multimillionaires, like streaming your game and playing it and having people react to it.
I think there was, and I think it's not the same now, but there was this thing where like them playing your game on YouTube a lot of the time, because the ones that got popular, they were usually just kind of throwaway little fun things, like fun experiments. So it never really sold. So when we only spent 2 months from the game jam to making the full game, because we just thought like it's too risky otherwise, because there wasn't really a history of like these influencers basically making your game blow up. Like nothing compared to like, you know, when you see like Among Us, right, or Fall Guys, you know, they were huge and massive all through that influence drive. There was nothing like that back then. Your game being played by YouTubers just didn't equate to sales, right? So we had a limited time on it. We had some fun with it because we knew we were making achievements, and because the previous game jam the videos that they'd done then had gone viral, we were picking little moments that were like the highlights of their videos. Like, so for example, like in Rooster Teeth, the Rooster Teeth one, there's one where like there's like a magic trick scenario where they go to open the heart transplant box and they waft the cloth over it, and then it disappears and it's no longer there anymore. And it was just a moment that kind of became famous, because like Michael is screaming at Gavin and being like, you threw it against the wall like a wet paper towel. And so then we just added that as an achievement. So if you just lob the heart off to the side, you get an achievement that says, you know, you threw it against the wall like a wet paper towel. And that like really then involved all of those communities, because all of the achievements, or at least a chunk of them, were references to those old, like those, you know, those really popular like videos from those influencers. And it just meant that almost like the community felt like they were in on a joke, and that kind of got them excited and talking about it. And there was that extra buzz, because then when the full game came out, all those influencers were like, we're going to do our achievement, and then they would earn it, and it would be, you know, a big moment in the videos. So I think we were just inexplicably like reacting in that way. Really, we were just like desperate for content, because we were like, it's like tangent, but I remember the day before launch, me and the programmer Tom, we played through the game, and we completed it in less than 10 minutes. And we had that realization of like, oh crap, we just made a game with less than 10 minutes of content. Thankfully, less than 50% of people even finished the first level, so that was fine.
Speaking of realizations, can you go through what was going through emotionally and mentally when you found out that your game was starting to sell really well? Because like you said, some of those don't equivalent to sales when YouTubers play them, but some of these games like Among Us are a real slow burn. What was it like when you woke up and started to see the graph go up as more and more people were buying your game?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, because it was the evening, and we went out for drinks afterwards, like, you know, be like, hey, we've launched, and we just glued to our phones the whole time, just like refreshing the Steam charts. And I remember we got to number 2 in the Steam charts. I don't know for how long. It was like a couple of days. But what was annoying is like on that day, Valve put Portal 2 on sale, and that took up the top spot the whole time. And we were just like, we would have been number 1, because at the time Portal 2 was still quite recent, and it was the first time it had been on sale. And yeah, and we were just really like, we've never had a game top 1. So I Am Bread and Surgeon Simulator have only ever reached the number 2 slot. It's always a thing where it's just like, we're so close, just getting a screenshot of being on the top of top sellers. But then after that, I remember just being like, you couldn't, and it sounds like, you know, it's something that I always had to sort of check, sort of how lucky we were, because when you're at a point where you can't ever watch all of the videos that have been made of a game of yours, that's like an insanely lucky position to have. And I remember just like our concept of like how many views something just got completely warped. Like if a video wasn't over 1 million, we were like, oh well, you know, that's not a very popular one. And this is back when those little numbers were already insane. So yeah, it was crazy, and it was just to be like, just how many videos there were. I don't know what the total is now. I know we did like we did like a calculation like a few years back, and even then it was over 10 million videos, like individual videos.
It's an absurd number. I remember specifically a lot of like now super popular influencers got their start by playing your game and reacting to it. Like that was one of their first things they did.
Yeah, and it kind of like, it definitely almost, I don't know whether it kickstarted it or made people realize that, you know, if there is a game like that can kind of go viral, it can launch your career. Because yeah, there was definitely a few that kind of really got put on the map with them. And even now you can see that like Surgeon Simulator is still, you know, years later, it's still their top video if you look at like the views and stuff. So yeah, it was a complete accident.